So, Prince William and Catherine have just confirmed that Queen Camilla has been formally ordered to vacate Windsor Lodge, and the way this all unfolded is genuinely more calculated than most people realize because for months, Camilla had been operating as though the residence was hers by right, not a conditional arrangement, not a family trust, but her personal domain. She wasn't just staying there. She was quietly, deliberately, redesigning the entire operation, approving significant structural changes without consultation, removing long-serving staff who had worked under 3 different monarchs, restricting which family members could even walk through the doors, and presenting the whole thing to guests like Charles had given her the keys permanently. No paperwork required, and for weeks, nobody pushed back. That silence gave her room. It allowed her to believe that status was enough, that her position as queen would prevent anyone from checking her authority. But there's a difference between someone believing they have unlimited power and actually having it. Catherine noticed something that at first seemed trivial, maybe even routine. Several personal items connected to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had disappeared from the rooms where they were always kept. Not moved for cleaning, not shifted during maintenance work, they had been wrapped, labeled, and moved into storage. Under instructions that traced back to Camilla's office, William never approved it. Catherine was never consulted. The family wasn't even told. Not until a staff member, clearly anxious about what they'd witnessed, finally broke ranks and spoke up. That one. Disclosure changed everything. What had looked like someone redecorating suddenly looked like someone trying to erase the identity of Windsor Lodge and replace it with her own authority. Portraits were repositioned, guest rooms reassigned, family arrangements canceled without explanation. Staff who questioned the orders were told that the residence now answered to the Queen, and they could take that however they wanted. Now, before we go any further, if you're enjoying this breakdown and you want more royal updates as they happen, hit that subscribe button and join us here at Crown Watch. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps the channel keep covering these stories. Okay, so Catherine didn't explode when she found out. That wouldn't have been her style. She did something way more effective. She asked for the records. Quietly, methodically, without raising alarms. She requested storage lists, renovation requests, access instructions, and any written objections from household administrators. And one of those warnings clearly stated that certain objects could not be moved without family approval. Camilla's office received that warning. The move went ahead anyway. That was the mistake. When Camilla's office received a formal objection and proceeded despite it, the question stopped being about furniture, about taste, about who preferred which portrait where. It became a matter of procedure. And when procedure is broken at this level, you're no longer dealing with a disagreement. You're dealing with a breach. That's when William got directly involved. He discovered that one sealed box contained something connected to Diana, an item he believed was protected from removal without his direct knowledge. For William, that was the moment the whole thing shifted. This was no longer a disagreement over interior decorating or room assignments. It was a challenge to family memory, to palace procedure, and to the limits of Camilla's authority. He wanted one answer. Who gave the final order? The paper trail didn't end with some junior aide. It led through Camilla's private office, past 2 separate objections, and into a chain of instructions that treated Windsor Lodge as though it were her personal territory. And here's where it gets even. Messier.royal resources had been used to pay for changes that were never properly approved. Furnishings were listed as necessary replacements. Decorative work appeared under structural upkeep. Staff assigned to official duties were redirected to support Camilla's private arrangements. That discovery put her in a position she couldn't explain away with status or ceremony. You can justify your taste in furniture. You can't justify misusing household funds when the invoices tell a different story. Catherine still tried to keep this from becoming public. That part is important. Her first instinct wasn't retaliation, it was containment. She knew how quickly a private disagreement could become a public spectacle, and she also knew that Charles would be stuck in the middle the moment Camilla felt cornered. So she chose the quiet route. A message was sent requesting a private conversation away from staff, away from cameras, away from the people already whispering through the corridors. The meeting was brief. Catherine raised the missing belongings first. She explained that several objects tied to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had been moved without consultation, and that the staff changes were starting to affect family access. She didn't accuse, she didn't threaten, she simply asked for the removals to be paused until William and the household administration could review what had happened. Camilla did not retreat. According to people familiar with the exchange, she responded with the confidence of someone who believed the matter was already settled. Windsor Lodge, she said, now fell under her authority. The staffing decisions were hers. The renovations were hers. Catherine, in Camilla's view, should focus on her own household and stop interfering in arrangements that no longer concerned her. That sentence changed the temperature of the room. Catherine had approached the conversation to prevent humiliation. Camilla treated the restraint as weakness. There was no apology for the removed possessions, no concern about the family members affected, and no suggestion that anything would be reconsidered. Instead, Catherine was left with a warning disguised as a dismissal. Step back, or the situation would become more uncomfortable. But Catherine didn't step back. Over the next several days, the restrictions tightened. A family visit that had been approved weeks earlier was canceled without explanation. 2 long-serving employees were told their roles were under review. A guest suite used during earlier family gatherings was reassigned for Camilla's private visitors. New aides began checking names at the entrance, even when those names belonged to people who had entered the lodge freely for years. The message was unmistakable. Camilla was building control before anyone could question whether she had the right to build it. One employee described the atmosphere as careful and tense. Staff members stopped speaking openly in shared rooms. Instructions arrived verbally, then were repeated through private messages that vanished from the usual administrative channels. Some workers obeyed because they feared losing their positions. Others quietly began saving copies. Catherine did the same. Every canceled arrangement was recorded. Every staffing change was dated. Every request for access was placed beside the response it received. She gathered storage lists, renovation notes, security instructions, and the names of those ordered to carry out each change. What had begun as a family disagreement was becoming a file. Then a former member of the lodge staff came forward with a detail that pulled William directly into the dispute. The renovations were not being funded solely through Camilla's private office. Invoices showed that royal household resources had been used for alterations that never received full approval. Payments had been attached to maintenance codes broad enough to avoid immediate attention. New furnishings were listed as necessary replacements. Decorative work appeared under structural upkeep. Staff assigned to official duties were being redirected to support Camilla's private arrangements. There was no longer a question of taste. It was a question of authority. When William was shown the records, he didn't react with the kind of anger Camilla might have expected. He became quiet. He read every page. He asked who had approved the payments, who had reassigned the staff, and who had authorized the storage of items linked to Diana. Each answer led back to the same place, Camilla's office. William then requested the original papers governing Windsor Lodge. Not a summary, not an aide's explanation, the actual documents. He wanted the ownership record, the occupancy terms, the funding conditions, and every amendment attached to them. Palace administrators began searching. At first, the assumption inside Camilla's circle was that the review would confirm what she had been telling people, that Charles had given her broad control, that her position was secure, that William might object but couldn't reverse anything without openly challenging the king. Then, an archivist found a line buried inside the residence file. The wording did not describe permanent ownership. It did not grant Camilla an unrestricted lease. It referred to a conditional family arrangement, one that depended on continued approval and proper use of the property. And beneath that line was another reference, a separate clause. That clause didn't concern decoration. It concerned misuse, unauthorized spending, restricted access, and the power to withdraw occupancy when family property was treated as personal territory. One that Camilla's office appeared never to have read. William didn't confront Camilla the moment the clause was found. He waited until the residence file had been checked against funding records, staffing orders, and instructions that moved family possessions into storage. He wanted no gaps, no easy denial, no room to dismiss the matter as a misunderstanding. By the time the meeting was arranged, he had seen enough. Camilla entered believing the discussion would be about procedure. William made it clear that it was about conduct. He placed the documents in front of her one by one. The canceled visits, the reassigned employees, the renovation charges, the access restrictions, the storage order linked to Diana's belongings. Then he asked the question she had avoided. What gave her the right? Camilla didn't answer with a document. She answered with status. She said the residence had been placed at her disposal. The household understood her position, and Charles had no objection to the changes. In her view, that was enough. The king's approval didn't need to be written down every time she replaced a staff member or altered a room. William disagreed. He reminded her that Windsor Lodge was not a private reward. It carried family history, official costs, protected objects, and arrangements involving more than one household. A verbal understanding could not erase written conditions, nor could it justify moving possessions connected to his mother without telling him. That was when Camilla changed her approach. She warned that pushing the matter further would embarrass Charles. Any public dispute over the lodge would make it appear that the king couldn't control his own family. It would create headlines, deepen tensions, and invite questions about who truly held authority inside Windsor. The warning was deliberate. William understood. Back down and the family avoided a scene. Continue, and he would be blamed for causing one. He continued. William ordered a review of every decision made since Camilla began treating the lodge as her personal residence. Officials were instructed to examine occupancy, security, staffing, spending, maintenance, guest access, and the removal of belongings. Nothing would be accepted on reputation alone. Every claim required proof. Catherine became the center of that review. She had preserved the written objections sent by household administrators. Some warned that long-serving staff could not be removed without consultation. Others questioned maintenance accounts used for private alterations. One message asked Camilla's office to delay the transfer of family objects until their status had been confirmed. The response was brief. Proceed as instructed. That line removed the possibility of confusion. Camilla's office had been told there were limits. It chose to continue. More records followed. A security note showed names connected to William's household on a restricted access list. A staffing memo described rooms once reserved for family visits as being under the exclusive direction of Camilla's aides. An invoice included work requested before approval. Piece by piece, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This was not one bad decision. It was a system. The most revealing evidence came from an administrator who attended an earlier planning meeting. Camilla had spoken about the lodge as though its future was settled. She discussed new guest arrangements, a revised staff structure, and rooms no longer available for shared family use. When asked whether permanent authorization had been received, one aide replied that nobody would challenge the Queen. Yorkshire built the plan on that belief. William's review challenged it. By the end of the review, officials had reached a conclusion Camilla had not prepared for. Her position at Windsor Lodge was not protected by ownership, a permanent lease, or an unrestricted royal grant. She had been permitted to occupy the residence under conditions requiring proper use, shared access, and respect for its family purpose. The documents also gave the household authority to intervene when those conditions were broken. William requested one final verification. He wanted confirmation that the clause could be enforced without Charles signing a new order and without Camilla's consent. The answer arrived that evening. It could, but another discovery came with it. Catherine's file showed that Camilla had received 3 separate warnings before the review began. Each explained that her authority was conditional. Each asked her to reverse a decision. She ignored all three. The palace was no longer deciding whether Camilla had misunderstood the arrangement. It was deciding what to do about someone who had been warned, understood the risk, and carried on anyway. The file William ordered was no longer a collection of concerns. It had become a map of how Camilla's control had been built, decision by decision, while everyone around her assumed someone else had approved it. Catherine arranged the material in sequence. First came the room plans, then the staffing schedules, then the storage records. After that came the instructions given to security, the invoices attached to maintenance accounts, and the correspondence that showed how objections had been handled. Not answered, overruled, ignored. One photograph drew William's attention immediately. It showed a sitting room before the alterations began. A second image taken days later showed the same room stripped of several family pieces. The replacement furniture had already arrived. A new portrait had been positioned above the mantel. The room no longer looked shared. It looked claimed. That was the point. The changes were not random. They followed a clear design. Camilla's personal guests were given priority. Her aides controlled access. Staff loyal to the old household were moved away from key areas. Objects connected to earlier generations were removed from view. Every alteration made the lodge feel less like a family residence and more like an extension of her private court. Catherine understood something then. Camilla's remark about focusing on her own household had not been spoken in frustration. It reflected a plan already in motion. Catherine and William were not simply being asked to tolerate new decoration. They were being pushed outside a residence Camilla intended to control completely. The strongest evidence came from a long-serving employee who had remained silent until that point. The employee had been present when the first storage instructions were discussed and had watched concern spread among the older staff. Nobody wanted to defy the Queen. Nobody wanted to lose a position held for decades. But one instruction had felt too serious to forget. The employee had kept a copy. It was signed. The document ordered the removal of several protected belongings and directed staff to complete the transfer before the next scheduled family visit. The timing mattered. It showed that the objects were not moved because of urgent repairs. They were moved before William and Catherine could see what was happening. Then Catherine found the warning attached to it. The warning had been sent 2 days earlier. It stated that the listed belongings required consultation and that no transfer should proceed until ownership and family access had been confirmed. The instruction to remove them came afterward. Camilla's office knew. That discovery ended the last credible claim that the dispute had grown from confusion. The order had not slipped through an overloaded office. It had been issued after the risk was explained in writing. The atmosphere inside the review team changed. Officials who had remained cautious began speaking more directly. The lodge had been treated as private territory. Royal resources had supported the change. Family access had been set aside. Still, Camilla's representatives tried one final defense. They said Charles had given verbal permission. That claim forced the review into its most sensitive stage. Officials searched for anything that could support it: a signed letter, a lease amendment, a royal warrant, a note from the king's private secretary, even a diary entry confirming that permanent authority had been discussed. There was nothing. Charles may have allowed Camilla to use the lodge. That was not the same as granting ownership. He may have known she wanted changes. That was not proof that he authorized the removal of protected belongings, the use of household money, or the restriction of family access. Words spoken privately could not erase conditions accepted in writing. William then asked whether the occupancy could be terminated without creating a new constitutional dispute. The legal advisors returned to the clause and tested it against every action in Catherine's file. Their conclusion was firm. The conditions had been broken repeatedly, and the household held the power to withdraw the arrangement. William and Catherine approved the next step. A formal notice was prepared. It listed the breaches, ordered all unauthorized work to stop, restored control to the household administration, and required Camilla's personal staff to leave the residence. There was one final line. The keys had to be surrendered by a fixed deadline. When the notice reached Camilla, the reaction inside Windsor Lodge was immediate. Doors closed. Calls were made. Staff were told not to speak. One aide insisted the decision would be reversed before morning, but morning came. Nothing changed. The deadline remained. And while Camilla's office searched for someone willing to stop it, palace officials were already preparing inventories, access orders, and a security plan for the handover. For the first time, the question was no longer whether she would leave, but how she would react. The deadline arrived under a Windsor morning, and the vehicle through the gates did not belong to Camilla. It carried 2 household officials, a security supervisor, and the inventory team overseeing the handover. No photographers waited outside. No announcement had been prepared. The palace wanted the transfer completed quietly before rumor hardened into something it couldn't control. Inside the lodge, Camilla's aides were moving. Personal files disappeared from desks. Garment cases were carried down the main staircase. Framed photographs were wrapped in cloth and placed beside labeled boxes. One assistant moved quickly between rooms checking drawers and cupboards against a private list. Another stood at the entrance demanding to know who had authorized officials to enter before Camilla had finished speaking with Charles. The answer was contained in the notice. Authority had returned to household administration at the deadline. From that moment, no room could be closed to inspection, no item could leave without being checked, and no member of Camilla's private staff could remain after the final handover. The officials didn't argue. They read the terms and began. That calm made the scene worse. Camilla had expected resistance she could turn into outrage. Raised voices would have allowed her to claim disrespect. A public confrontation would have made William look reckless. Instead, every movement was measured, every box was logged, every doorway was opened under written authority. The process gave her nothing dramatic to fight. Then the first dispute began. A set of silver frames had been placed among Camilla's personal effects, but the inventory marked them as part of the lodge collection. Her aide insisted they had been gifts. The officials asked for records. None were produced. The frames remained. A writing desk was next, then 2 paintings, then a cabinet containing correspondence from an earlier royal household. Each time the same rule applied. Personal property could leave, family property could not. Room by room, the boundary Camilla had ignored was being restored. William and Catherine were not present. That was deliberate. Their absence prevented Camilla from turning the handover into a personal spectacle. Yet their authority sat in every document on the table. Catherine's records had established a pattern. William's review had activated the clause. The officials now carried out the decision neither of them intended to reverse. Camilla finally entered the entrance hall before midday. She was composed at first. She asked to see the senior official, questioned the timetable, and said the residence could not be surrendered while discussions with the king were continuing. The official replied that any family discussion would not suspend the notice. The deadline had passed. The occupancy had ended. That was when the restraint cracked. Camilla accused Catherine of engineering the humiliation from the beginning. She said the questions about staff and storage had been excuses designed to weaken her position and portray her as an intruder. Then she turned her anger toward William. He was using Diana's memory, she said, to punish anyone who challenged him. The room went still. William's response had already been written into the handover instructions. The removal was not punishment for personal history. It followed repeated breaches involving access, staffing, spending, and protected family property. No accusation could change the record. Camilla rejected that explanation. She demanded that one private sitting room remain sealed until Charles personally decided its status. Her aide produced a separate key and refused to place it with the others. For several minutes, everything stopped. The security supervisor checked the notice. The senior official opened the full occupancy schedule. Every room within the lodge was listed. There was no private exception, no retained suite, and no surviving right of access after termination. The last defense collapsed. Camilla was told that keeping the key would amount to refusing to hand over. The official didn't threaten her. He simply stated what would happen next. Security would open the room, document its contents, and record that the key had not been surrendered voluntarily. The aide looked toward Camilla. She gave a small nod. The key was placed on the table. By late afternoon, the personal vehicles were ready. Camilla's staff left in stages, watched by officials who checked every package against the inventory. The final boxes were loaded. The entrance hall emptied. At the gates, one vehicle paused before joining the road away from Windsor. Inside, the silence returned, but the palace still had a decision to make. Advisors wanted no public confirmation. They believed the family could describe the departure as a routine change and allow the story to fade. William and Catherine disagreed. Too many people already knew. Too many records existed. Silence would leave room for another version. That evening, they decided to speak, and what they were prepared to confirm would make Camilla's departure impossible to disguise. William and Catherine chose their words carefully, but there was no softness in the meaning. Camilla had vacated Windsor Lodge. Her private staff no longer controlled the residence. The keys had been returned. The unauthorized work halted, and household administration had resumed authority over every room, account, and access point. The confirmation traveled quickly. Inside palace offices, aides understood what the public did not. This was not a voluntary move. It was the result of a review that exposed how far Camilla had gone while assuming nobody would challenge her. She had treated the residence as permanent. The document said otherwise. William didn't celebrate. He ordered the restoration to begin. Staff reopened storage records and identified every object removed during Camilla's occupation. They worked from photographs, inventories, and earlier room plans. Items connected to Queen Elizabeth were separated from general furnishings. Objects linked to Diana were checked against William's records before being returned. One box remained sealed longer than the others. It contained the personal item that first drew William into the dispute. The wrapping was intact, but the label showed it had been scheduled for transfer elsewhere. Had the employee not spoken, the item might have disappeared into a wider royal collection, far from the lodge and beyond. The notice of those who knew its history. Catherine watched the restoration without turning it into a victory display. For her, the outcome was never about taking a residence from another woman. It was about drawing a boundary. Shared property could not be claimed through confidence. Family memory could not be cleared from a room because it made someone uncomfortable. Authority required limits, even when the person testing them wore a crown. That lesson was written into the record. Long-serving employees who had been removed were contacted. Some were offered their former positions. Others were asked to help rebuild the household structure. Guest arrangements returned to neutral control. Private aides lost the power to decide which family members could enter. The lodge was no longer an extension of Camilla's office, but the victory came with damage. Charles now faced questions he could not dismiss. How much had he known? Had he approved the renovations? Or had Camilla used his name because she believed nobody would ask him directly? Did he understand royal funds supported private changes? Most importantly, did he know belongings connected to his late mother and Diana had been removed after written warnings? No answer came. The silence protected the king, but it did not protect trust. William had learned the family assurances were useless without proof. Catherine had learned that private diplomacy could be mistaken for weakness. Camilla had learned that status could delay consequences, but it could not erase a signed condition once the evidence was assembled. The balance inside Windsor shifted. Staff became careful about verbal instructions. Administrators demanded written approval for decisions once handled through private conversations. Security teams reviewed who could restrict access to shared residences. Every household understood the message. William and Catherine would challenge anyone who treated royal tradition as personal property. Camilla's departure therefore became larger than one lodge. It marked the moment her authority met a limit she could not move. She had believed Charles's position would protect every decision. She had believed Catherine would remain polite, William would avoid scandal, and staff would stay silent. Each belief failed. The fall was self-inflicted. Had Camilla paused after the first warning, the dispute might have ended privately. Had she restored the belongings, reviewed the spending, or reopened family access, William may never have ordered the investigation. Instead, every refusal added another page to Catherine's file. Every attempt to tighten control created another witness. By the time the notice arrived, the case against her had been built by her own decisions. By nightfall, the restored rooms had been inspected. The lodge was quiet again, but not with fear. It was the silence that follows a struggle when everyone understands the rules have changed. William and Catherine had not simply removed Camilla from Windsor Lodge. They had shown her that invoking Charles would no longer be enough, and the next confrontation may be more serious. If you've made it this far, what do you think about how William and Catherine handled this? Was it the right move, or should they have found another way? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one, and we're genuinely curious what you think about how this all played out.